Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me. I hope you've had a good week in Washington. We actually, we had a little snow today. I don't know if you saw that, but that is a sign of all the upheaval we're having in Washington, that there is actually snow. I look forward to being in conversation with my friend Glenn, and we can talk a bit about the world and talk about the theme of today, which I think is important, seeing from the other side. But I thought I would take a couple of minutes to frame a little bit of where we are in Washington and the world that I think is still reeling a bit and adjusting to a pretty big election that we've had in this country. I think often of that Rudyard Kipling quote, or a kind of take on it, which is, if you can keep your head when others around you are losing theirs, perhaps you fail to realize just how serious the situation is. You know, I think our election was surprising to a lot of people, but it really shouldn't have been shocking, right? I mean, we were in a situation where throughout the campaign, it was incredibly close in the polls, and as it turned out, it was actually less close than it appeared to be, which is a troubling sign, I think, for our polling industry, for the media generally, but also the fact that there's just been an underestimation of President Trump's widespread popularity in the country. And if in 2016 his ascent was seen as kind of anomalous, I think in 2024 it's seen as both deep and wide. And I think that's really important. So I wanted to make a couple of observations about, you know, what happened from my point of view. I think there's some basic points to make and then perhaps some deeper issues to consider as well. I want to be careful to say as well, and this will be true in my conversation with Glenn, except for perhaps my views about the media, I'm going to be determined not to make a judgment about some of what's happening in our world today. I'm going to try instead just to be more analytical about it, because I just think that would be more prudent and more constructive for our time today. I certainly do have lots of views on lots of things, but I don't necessarily think that this is the place. I wanted to make some basic points. Inflation is bad. And inflation is bad for politicians. It was true for Jimmy Carter, it was true for Kamala Harris, it was true for Joe Biden. It is true what James Carville said, which it is the economy, stupid. Economic conditions in the country were such that it provided an inescapable, insurmountable problem for Democrats in this election cycle. If you're an incumbent president, which in effect she was as the vice president, when you have a president who's really unpopular, it's hard to get reelected. It just is. It's just how it works. I also think we can now see from the evidence that Kamala Harris was a weak candidate. She underperformed President Biden significantly if you look at key demographic groups and in key states around the country. So she underperformed, and there'll be a lot of debate, there is now, it'll continue, about whether and had Joe Biden retreated off the stage earlier, giving the Democrats a chance to really run a primary process, whether there could have been a stronger candidate. That debate will rage. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I think that may be true. Maybe they would have landed on a different candidate. I do, however, think there were a lot of headwinds. I also think I can say analytically that as a candidate, she failed to elevate and separate. So the elevate part is, I think that for a while there was this thought, and maybe President Obama had it, that somehow she was going to pick up that mantle from the Obama years and be something of a movement candidate. And to be fair to her, to them, there was something of that. Biden steps away, she comes in, there's a flood of money. That was really just anti-Trump fear money, you know, coursing toward her. And, you know, there was a little bit of this, you know, movement about her. I think that was a lot of fairy dust, honestly. I think that part of the issue that President Obama had in his legacy is that he was always a singular political sensation who happens, in my judgment, because of 9/11, and which is an international group, international focus group. So I have a keen belief that if 9/11 doesn't happen, you have no Barack Obama. Again, it's very a facile thing to say, you know, take the biggest event of this century and talk about how it would have changed things had it not happened. I understand that, but what I'm saying is he represented such change in 2008 from the war years of George W. Bush, and yes, he was something of a movement candidate that people fell in love with. I just don't think you can say anything similar about Kamala Harris. And the notion, you know, we look at moments in campaigns, her inability to say how she would have, you know, how she'd be different than President Biden proves to be very costly, because inflation, the headwind of him being so unpopular, you could have seen, you know, the need for all of that. Some deeper issues to introduce, at least. I do think the Democratic Party has gotten out of touch with the electorate. I think that we see this over time, that there's been a lurch toward the left, and it hasn't worked out for them. Very few lurches to the left, I think, since FDR have really worked out for Democrats. And so you had the party, and I do think a kind of the establishment class that has grown more out of touch with how people are feeling in the country. Key voting groups, voters overall. I mean, it's worth noting that President Trump, for all of the baggage he has, for all of the mistakes that he's made, for all of the things that you would think would make him unpopular, improved his standing across the board, everywhere in America, among almost every group in America. It's an astounding thing to consider as a political result. I have a big belief, having covered politics and covered leaders, that voters tend to make a decision about what they're prepared to compromise on. I do think that there are examples of people truly falling in love. This is before my time, but in my reading of history, I think people felt that way in some quarters about RFK. I think they certainly felt that way about President Kennedy. I think there was some element of that in my lifetime around President Obama. But otherwise, there's always some element, especially in our modern political culture, of people feeling that both of these candidates are both flawed, almost hopelessly so. So you say, well, what am I prepared to compromise on? And it turns out that there's a big schism here that I think the media continues to miss, which is that a lot of people are willing to compromise about things with President Trump that others aren't. You know, the people who think, well, he's going to be responsible for, you know, ruining our democracy or overturning our democracy. For a lot of voters, that's simply a luxury that they don't think about. And they're otherwise focused, and they're looking at other redeeming qualities they believe he has. That was true of other presidents as well. Think of President Clinton, you know, who had certainly a pretty scandalous past when he was running, was thought to be disingenuous at the very least in lots of ways. But people said, hey, yeah, don't love that part, but he's got all these other redeeming qualities. And he ultimately becomes a two-term president. So this question of what people are prepared to compromise on is something that I think the media has lost some touch on. And it's a broader point. I think our media landscape, which I think we'll talk about a little bit more fully, has become so broken apart. And I do think there's a kind of moral revulsion to President Trump in what is now called, I think, better, I don't like mainstream media because that was really a term that was brought up by the right to be pejorative, so I don't like that. But I do think legacy media is appropriate, and I do think legacy media has lost its way in its sensibility about how to cover voters, how to cover elections. There's too much I've seen that has turned me off too much. And it's so liberating to say that because people can disagree with me or be mad at me, and I don't care anymore because I don't have to answer to anybody. So that's really fun. I also there's also a tendency, I think, at this deeper level to say, oh my gosh, we've never been here before. And I think it's worth remembering that history teaches us a lot, that we've actually had these moments before. And I think there are some parallels. Again, in my reading of history, I think a little bit of 1968. 1968, Lyndon Johnson had backed out, so it's the only time we've had that since, until Biden did it. So Nixon is running against Humphrey. It's the war, it's the anti-war protests, it's the civil rights movement, and he essentially runs saying, the left has gotten out of control, and the country's out of control, and I'm here for the silent majority, or he actually used the term that Trump has used, the forgotten Americans. None of this stuff is new. They all have used it before. The idea of dawn again in America, morning again in America, or as in a more modern incarnation, Trump, which is the golden era is going to return again. It's all a play on the same theme. Reagan used it, Nixon used it. But I do think that there's been a sense in the country, maybe I think post-COVID, that there's elements of the country that are out of control. That the border's out of control, which, by the way, the Democrats came around to recognizing was true, which is why both Biden and then Harris proposed draconian measures that so upset the left to try to get closer to Trump on the border, because they had ignored it for so long. Campus protests over Israel-Gaza, all the anti-racist movement in the country and some of those protests. I do think there's been a backlash to that. And I think that we've seen some analogs to this before in our history. Because I think voters often are looking for, how do I correct what I think was wrong with the past 4 years? So if you think there's been a liberal agenda that's kind of out of control and out of pace with you, we're going to go for a real change candidate. And Harris did not amount to a change candidate. She wanted to turn the page. What she was really trying to say was, I'm going to turn the page on Trump and Biden, but she couldn't quite say it with more than a wink and a nod on Biden, which I think was a mistake. And she tried to do it on Trump, but it was too hard as a sitting vice president to say, I represent all of this change, when you have a guy like Trump. Even though he's been president before, there's no question that he represents change, whether you like it or not. A couple of thoughts about Trump moving forward. I do think President Trump is a transactional figure. I don't think he's an ideological figure. Ironically, he delivered for the right in incredible ways, particularly on the Supreme Court. And I remember asking the founder of the Christian Coalition, Ralph Reed, in part on my spiritual journey and some of my own exploration around my book. I said, help me understand, Ralph, help me understand why evangelical Christians are willing to support President Trump. And he said, David, even the Hebrews wanted a king. Even the Israelites wanted a king. And so that's the idea, that people, they want strength. They felt that way about Reagan. People want strong leaders. And I think for a lot of voters, that's what Trump represents. I mentioned he's transactional. I also think he likes a certain amount of mayhem, which we've seen already in his initial picks for his cabinet. I don't understand it. I don't understand all the thinking there, especially when he's willing to pull back on somebody like Matt Gaetz. But I think there's a kind of chaos that he likes to be around him. He's had opportunities to become more disciplined. I do think he wants to be respected and seen as credible. I think his taking on the news media is a bit of a front. I still think he wants to be respected by the New York Times because that's the paper he read growing up and that his father read. So there's parts of him that I think are difficult to get your head around. He wants to project strength and be such a strong leader, and yet he's an isolationist and wants to end more wars. So how he plays on the international stage is, to me, more in the realm of transaction, that he believes in the power of his personal relationship to affect change. I covered President George W. Bush. He believed the same thing about Vladimir Putin, that the power of their relationship could affect change. I think President Bush would have to admit that he was wrong about that. But I think the personality level to the presidency is particularly strong right now in a figure who doesn't believe in the international system or international norms, and who believes in much more of a kind of chaos theory. Let me end before our conversation on two other pieces. This theme of seeing from the other side, I think, is important, and I thought about it in a couple of different ways. The first is with our representatives from the International Diplomatic Corps here. How does America look to the rest of the world, right? What's happening there? I think in my time covering particularly 9/11 and its aftermath, the world has started to ask, what is America prepared to fight and die for post 9/11? Where, when, and how are we prepared to use our influence? Certainly in Europe, there's a lot of fear right now that they're going to have to do this on their own. Think about Ukraine. Think about their own security, the future of NATO. Certainly our allies in the Middle East have been asking that question for a long time, but there are consequences to projecting American power to the extent that we did after 9/11, and we are still feeling the residual effects of those wars now. We also, I think, can say about this incoming administration that the notion of an international system or international order is set to be disrupted. It is in the throes of massive disruption right now, and I think that will certainly continue with an administration that doesn't believe in the old ways of how the international system operated. And I think it's fair that other countries look at America and say, kind of, how could you? How could you do this? I think some of that comes from a place of fear. Some of it comes from a place of revulsion even, disappointment. And, I can understand that. But at the same time, there's a lot happening in our society. And there's lots of reasons why Trump has happened and why our politics have been disrupted to the point that they have. And the last point about seeing from the other side that I think is important and I think critical to the work that you're doing here is, are we willing to take stock and take time in a moment like this to try to really see and understand other people? I have a daughter who goes to school at Princeton and is, my darling little girl, and I think of her, she's perfect. And but she's a very fair-minded person, and she was talking to me about, her views of Trump and how she can seek to engage people and without judging them. And I said, I think that's really it. I think this is a time to try to understand. And I phrase it this way, which is, I think we ought to be not asking, how could you, but why did you? And I think that's a kind of framing that gets us to a place where we try to understand where people are coming from. We've devolved to a point in our politics in this country where we interpret support for a political candidate to be a statement of who you are more than what you believe in. And I think people are entitled to have views and to say, this is what was important to me, or here's how I'm coming at it. And I don't agree with this, but I do think this is important. And we ought to get to a place where there can be a little bit more understanding about that. But we're living in a media climate that makes that very difficult, because what we're finding a lot more comfort in is running to those safe spaces that we create for ourselves, where we get validation. We don't necessarily get information, we get ammunition. And that makes the job of seeing from the other side all the more difficult. And so with that, we can continue the conversation with my friend Glenn.
Thank you, David.
You're welcome.
So that was a great framing for what I'd love to start off with, which is, so you've been in the media a very long time, 30 plus years. Things have changed a lot. So when would you date that? I know it's a progression, it's not a moment in time, but you covered the George W. Bush administration, we had the war on terror. There's a lot that came out of that. Was that the moment when things started changing more dramatically in how the media covers the world?
I really think it was the impact of the internet, and because what the internet did was introduce the notion of a kind of democratization of information. So all of a sudden, the notion of who was a journalist changed. So you could be a blogger, and you could catch fire. You could get followers, in a different way. People could read your blog. And so that started to break up the old order of, I do love when people say to me, oh, I wish it were like, the golden era, when Walter Cronkite, was there and people trusted the news. I'm like, really? I said, yeah, well, that was great. I said, except for the fact, I don't think a lot of women thought that was so great because there were no women in those positions. I don't think people of color thought it was so great because they certainly weren't represented at the higher echelons. You had a lot of white men in New York deciding what the news is. So there was geographic bias, there was elitism, there was this shared sensibility. That's what made up the core of the news. I was telling you the story earlier that, is a fact of history, that the great legacy of the 1968 Democratic Convention is like the valor of the left and those kids who were marching in the streets and the cops unloading on them. And again, that may be your point of view if you remember that era. The truth is, the media represented this as like some great horror. Most of the country agreed with the police and agreed with Mayor Daley. But again, that was the center of media then. That changed the internet, and that paved the way, Glenn, for then cable. And what cable did too was basically chip away and ultimately destroy the foundation of the major news sources and its ubiquitousness made it the center. And then, of course, then the progression is into social media that then displaces everything. So the notion of what comes directly to us as opposed to us having to go to the news is what takes shape as what is supposed to be media today or information today. And so that's ultimately the regression into a super siloed space where we have some real information problems.
Let's talk about those for a minute.
Yeah.
So we have a world where facts are what you want to make them to be, and fake news and so forth. Can you talk about that? Because in the old days, maybe they weren't as great as we thought they were, but at least you had a sense that the media was relatively straight down the middle, and you were likely to be hearing things that were true.
Right. So look, I think there's a lot of great journalism today. The difficulty is, do you know how to find it, and are you media literate? I was explaining to my mother, now granted she's 83, but she gets those push notifications and she thinks that that's news. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it's just political, talking points. So there's false information is false information, and it's pushed by foreign sources sometimes. It can be just pushed with people with an agenda. And it's sometimes difficult to be able to separate a different take on what's happening, a different point of view, with what is verifiably true. And that is a problem. So I don't believe that, yes, of course there's bias throughout the media. There's obvious bias where they're not trying to hide it, but there's also a sensibility, which I think is almost more important. It's like, we're sitting around our table and we generally have a shared view of the world. And nothing really challenges that, so that's how we proceed to figure out what to cover, how to cover it, how much weight to give it. And those choices are really, really significant. And so if I just watch Fox News, here's the problem with Fox News. They have a systemic bias. And so they were on this whole business of Biden being too old and losing it. But because they hammered it so hard and because of their, what I think are credibility problems, people started to write it off. Well, guess what? They were right. And the legacy media was bullied by the White House and other Democrats into not going hard enough on the fact that Biden was not capable of being president. So this is where you find bias. This is what's not covered, how it's covered, what your credibility is. All of that has changed, but I think, Glenn, it goes back to, again, the notion of fake news was introduced with the idea that Trump called things fake news if he didn't like it. It didn't mean that they were actually fake. There is actual wrong information, and what I worry about is because we have and it's not even generational. In other words, it's easy to say, oh, you young people, you don't know what news is. The truth is, I was saying at our table, even in our generation too, we're getting less and less tethered to what's verifiably true, because we're losing our knowledge of, our literacy, our media literacy, or we're not working as hard. And it's unfair, really. It's kind of unfortunate, but we have to work hard to be properly educated. To get a good, nutritious information diet, you got to spend a little time knowing how to navigate it, and not everybody's willing to do that.
Yeah, yeah. The people in this room are, but that's a small percentage of folks that are willing to put the time in to get a diversity of viewpoints. So as you think about foreign policy and about how the media covers foreign policy, and then you talk about Fox versus maybe CNN and so forth, how is the coverage of, the news coverage of foreign affairs, how has it changed versus your days flying around the world with President Bush, where we still were in the world mostly of traditional media, being the dominant, and now it's no longer so? How has that changed?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I think, certainly from the vantage point of covering the world from the seat of a White House correspondent was I think very different then, because the White House press corps was still somewhat considered to be a useful filter for how to understand the presidency or how to understand America's projection of power in the world. I think that's less the case now, and it's not for lack of competent journalists who are covering the White House. I just think the media has changed to the point where we don't like filters for anything anymore. We like to go directly or hear directly, and presidents and other people, like to go directly to the people such as they can do that. I think coverage of events, I mean, you can take the most fraught topic of Israel-Gaza. To me, there's just so much bias that colors that coverage and so much manipulation that's involved. It's very difficult for news outlets, I think, to cover it and be seen as fair. I mean, part of it is just imagery of war has an effect on people that gets in the way of a kind of dispassionate telling or chronicling of what the conflict is. But, I think what buffets international coverage is much the same as domestic political coverage, which is the lens through which outlets are covering conflict or covering other news is just divisive. And I think there's a lot less appetite, unfortunately, in this country to really seek to understand the rest of the world beyond some of the real flashpoints. And so I don't think we have the commitment of resources to people who are overseas, outside of some of the major news organizations, and by that I still mean the New York Times or the Journal. I don't think TV covers the world. I mean, CNN has some excellent people, but I don't think the networks, while there's still some very good people, they just don't have the footprint that we used to have, and they don't expend the resources that we used to.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. If you want to get news from around the world, you almost have to listen to like the BBC, because if you listen to CNN or Fox, it's essentially 24/7 some version of Trump.
Right. No, I think that's right, but that's an important point, which is the tonnage, right? There's a business model involved in all of that, which is the tonnage of coverage of particular issues, and that's all based on the idea that you really want to circle around one big story. And Trump has forever changed. Look, I covered 9/11. That was the biggest event of my lifetime. It was certainly the biggest event, I believe, of the century. It's gonna stand up. But there was an exhaustion after a while, and you couldn't sustain that story. Trump is the story that never loses its power, because people can't look away, and I've never seen anything like it.
So he's a phenomenon. He's a kind of
there's no question. He's an historical force, and it's very interesting for such a divisive figure. You and I were talking about this earlier. I think people who don't like him would cough at this notion. But, is this another coming of Reagan? I mean, I think it's distinctly possible, because don't forget, if you're old enough to remember, people really loathed Ronald Reagan and thought he was an extremely dangerous figure for America and the world. They thought he was going to, set off World War III and all the things that had come before then. So we lose our memory in this country for things that we've been through, and we think that everything is so novel.
Let's talk for a minute about identity politics and how that has evolved over your time as a journalist, and what the implications of that are for today's politics, what the impact of that was on the most recent election. Thoughts there?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, if you want to look at Kamala Harris underperformed among African American men, for example. Obviously, she did extremely well. African American voters in America will vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. That's been the history. But if you see softening support there, which she did, that can be significant because, right, it's just the math. If you need in an area where there's a large African American vote, you've got to be so overwhelming to overcome areas where you'd be weaker in other parts of a particular state. So, I think Democrats have started to take for granted identity groups and think that they should just, vote for them regardless because of either fear of the other guy or because, they stand for these universal principles. And I think, views in these communities are not monolithic. I think, look at his performance among Latino men. That should tell you something. People respond to different things in politicians. Like I said, they're willing to compromise. They're motivated by different things. And I think identity politics has gotten away from seeing voters more as individuals. And I think there's a lot of, this notion of kind of people who feel forgotten, people who feel judged, people who feel like they're being condescended to. There's a reason why these phrases keep coming up. There's a reason why the notion of the forgotten American or the silent majority, why these have been politically potent in the past, is that there is such a thing as liberal elitism that courses through major aspects of society, media, the academy, and upper echelons of the establishment. And there is a lot of judgment implicit in those views toward other people. It can be people of faith. It can be, the assumption that women, say, are going to all vote the same way. And I think that's come back to hurt them. And so, look, I'm spending more time, admittedly, on picking apart Democrats here for obvious reasons. I mean, there's obviously a huge problem on the right. The fact that Trump and his brand of demagogic, not even Republican, just demagogic politics, he staged a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. I think most conservatives in America don't really know what to do with themselves. But they're in the court. I mean, but they're still winning, and they're sticking close to him, and they're going to have to figure all that out post-Trump. But right now, it's the Democrats who need to figure out the way back to power. And I think this, again, whatever your views, there is a sense in the country that the left and the agenda around certain social justice projects have gone too far. And I'm sorry, there's a lot of people that doesn't make them racist, it doesn't make them sexist, it doesn't make them homophobes, who think that it's just gotten out of hand. And even for people who don't focus on those issues so much, it's also potent ground for fear-mongering. And Trump has done all of that very well. And so, again, I'm not making a positive judgment about that in some of his tactics. I'm just saying there is fertile ground there to plow, and that's what he's ultimately done.
So, last question. You've been in the media for 30 plus years. Where do you, as you think forward 30 years, what does the media landscape look like?
Well, again, I think that this is what you're seeing today, part of what we don't like is still a very successful business model. So, as critical as I can be, I would also say to you, I think there's some absolutely fantastic content out there. But again, we as consumers have to work harder for it. There's great podcasts. I think legacy journalism is still terrific. I mean, I think there's lots of good things. I mean, the New York Times drives me crazy about certain things, but they're still the paper of record. I love the Wall Street Journal. I love the Financial Times, especially for coverage of Europe. But I understand where these outlets are coming from. I understand what motivates them. I understand what their take on the world is, and I'm good with that because I know. And then I can agree, I can disagree, I can think I'm missing something here. But I think that's going to continue, this kind of disaggregation. What I'm hopeful about, but I think we collectively, organizations like this, universities, we were talking earlier, a kind of civic education around media literacy so that we can understand the perils of social media and we can understand what it looks like to, what good information, what valuable information looks like. How do we evaluate it? How do we know it when we see it? How do we encourage it? Because otherwise we're going to be left with a kind of a race to the bottom in this kind of coverage that may be titillating, but it's not really very nourishing and it's not very enlightening. It's not good for society. It's not good for politics because I think all of these forces have changed politics, the practice of politics, who goes into it, how they practice it, and it's changing journalism as well. And the problem is that if we get more and more comfortable, I often say that citizenship has an impact and is derivative of journalism, but citizenship can affect journalism too. We have to start with ourselves. We have to start with our conversations over Thanksgiving, and with our friends. We have to be willing to not lose relationships because you have a huge fight over, your support for Israel versus what's happened in Gaza. You have to be able to coexist around these things, or your politics. So we have to be able to model some of this behavior if we're going to have some impact on what's ultimately, coming to us, made available to us as an information diet. So I think to bring it full circle, this seeing from the other side, we have to get back to asking why a little bit more instead of how could you. And I think that's a place to try to understand a little bit more deeply. And if that is a motive for even choosing our information, if we're trying to understand better, then it can dictate our choices.
Everyone, please join me in thanking David Gregory.
Thank you. Thanks.